Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that helps you discover deeper levels of truth, meaning, and wholeness. I'm your host, Artem, and today's guest is a political philosopher, sociologist, and a leader of the Nordic school of metamodernism. He received his PhD in sociology from the Lund University in Sweden. He's also one half of the Hanzi Freinacht duo, an alias under which he has released the Listening Society and the Nordic Ideology, two groundbreaking books that unpack the metamodern philosophy. Daniel Gortz, welcome to the show.
Good to meet you. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So I'd love to start with just a little bit of background of how you got interested in sociology and eventually into developmental thinking and the work that you're doing now.
Mm-hmm. So that's, of course, a lot to unpack, a life story, and how those core interests grow is always a rich fabric in everybody's life. But the brief story would be that starting already in high school years, I was into online gaming, and there created an online role-playing community with hundreds and hundreds of members, and where you would, you had to stay in character. So just creating all of those norms and culture from scratch was a bit of a was a bit of a laboratory. This was together with my brother. We had a lot of long conversations. We noticed a lot of dynamics about power structures. We didn't necessarily have the official sociological language for them, but we noticed that all of these things were there. Norms, power structures, the social construction of reality, roles, positionings in society, and that whole thing got me really curious about it. I guess I had a natural interest for that, for those kinds of social science topics and in school and education and so on. So eventually, when I did go to university, I studied similar topics. So did economics, political science, history of ideas, philosophy, and I found particularly sociology to be a very, very interesting and fruitful field. And there, I noticed in the authors, the classical authors, and then the later ones, that they had this sociological gaze on society, which in many of them it was coupled with a critical gaze of society, right? That things could be different, right? That things don't have to be the way they are in everyday life. That the structures, they are very limiting, yes, and they follow their own logics. But if you study those logics, study those structures, you can see wider fields of potential of what could be actual society, right? And around the same time, from roughly 18 to 25, a little bit older now, 38. Around that time, I also had a lot of existential anxiety, and in retrospect, I could have used maybe a bit of existential coaching or existential therapy, but I couldn't exactly diagnose those things at that time. So that made me notice particularly the spiritual underpinnings of the sociological tradition, and in authors like Erich Fromm, for instance, there's this spiritual revisiting of what our society is, or Western current society has, how it has evolved, and how alienation is a great part of it, and so on. And but that still left me, looking for more. After eventually, I felt there is a limit to the depth, the existential depth of the academic discipline as it was at particular departments and so on, and how the academic sociologists themselves were. So that got me, interested in topics like meditation, like spirituality, inner development. And I went for a few months to India. I went to a bunch of vipassanas, these 10-day retreats, and some other form of silent retreats and so on. And noticed that, well, if you do very serious work on meditation, you can actually turn around stuff like alienation, inner anxiety. And not only that, when you work through those things and you develop things like equanimity, non-identification with certain thought structures, those thought structures kind of become objects to you and so on, there's kind of an inner explosion that can happen, like those strong negative forces that kind of are stuck inside you. If you gently open them up in the right way, they're not actually bad, and there's an enormous energy or inspiration in those very dark places, right? Or that stems from those very dark places, this kind of inner light, kind of sense of clarity. And I felt, well, wow, that should have been a thing in society already. And around the same time, I came across integral theory, and I kind of been in the sociological realm. I've been looking for a map of different theories, and there were some different maps, but the meta theories they weren't very comprehensive or very well systematized, and they also excluded this inner realm, right? And in integral theory, I came across these maps, integral theory of Ken Wilber, and I came across the developmental perspective, and things looked very different once you picked up the developmental perspective. You'd say, well, I've been through some kind of huge perspective shift, some kind of awakenings in adult life that make you really reevaluate how you understand the world and your place in it. And I started viewing, I forgave the structures of society, I guess you could say. That was a bit of a catharsis thing to pick up a developmental perspective, because, well, things are as they are because they haven't at this point developed further. But there are potentials and fairly discernible directions for how human beings can develop in terms of psychology and personality, but also how societies in parallel can and perhaps should develop. That the developmental directionality going towards greater complexity of thinking, towards greater nuance, but also towards greater introspection and more focus on relationality. They seemed to hold within them solutions to unlocking the potential to be truly idealistic in a manner that is not corrupted by all of these drives for attention, for having an identity, for creating a countercultural shield against the alienation of society and so forth, right? So I started applying those perspectives first in academic life, and noticed that, well, it's a little bit too esoteric to explain integral theory to fellow academics. But if you just, without explaining the theory itself, you kind of just draw on those modes of reasoning, and it was almost as if I'd found a cheat code. You could enter any topic and you could kind of say interesting things about it from the get-go, right? So I felt, wow, this is really powerful. You kind of have to use this more actively to affect change in society in a desirable direction. And that kind of became my life mission. However, after a while, I felt with integral theory, there was perhaps too much baggage, spiritual and intellectual baggage that came particularly from Western adaptations of Eastern religions, and perhaps also certain flaws of individualism that came from the California culture, where this, which had been the vortex, so to speak, of this in the West. So I found this other term called metamodernism, which is another idea of what comes after postmodernism. And there were interesting parallels between metamodernism and integralism. Integralism also claims to be what comes after postmodern thinking, right? And I found the two to be fairly complementary. Most of all, I felt that integral theory, the way it had been formulated initially by Wilbur and others, wasn't so powerful as an agent of change, because it wasn't formulated as a political theory. It was also disconnected kind of from cultural currents, popular culture, and so on. Whereas metamodernism particularly focused on things happening in popular culture, in the arts, in architecture, and so forth. So if you marry those two things, you got the sincere irony that was in metamodern culture, together with the developmental sense of direction and the maps of knowledge that came from integral theory. You could actually craft political visions and sociological understanding, which could perhaps fulfill more of the promise that I had initially sensed in integral theory. So together with friends, that became a project to support political movements that have metamodern currents in them, or to write about it in the Hanzi books, and to, of course, gather and facilitate networks of people who do interesting things, be it in technology or an innovation or in spirituality, in the creation of events, or many other things. Well, at this point, perhaps metamodernism takes more fuel from being a term for experimental arts and spirituality and so forth, given that the political is too huge and difficult a field to truly enter at scale, right? So although I view metamodernism as an interesting and important political project at this point in time, I mostly support metamodernism as a spiritual or cultural trend, right?
Yeah, there was so much. I felt like that was a podcast on its own, that little segment that you just
it's
gave.
zip file, right? You unzip these files and they always kind of blow up in your
Yeah, and I hear your daughter in the background, so I just want to shout her out.
I think that's going to resolve itself. I think my daughter is going out for a walk in the
No worries. I think it adds to the flavor of it all. I'm also a new dad, so I know what that's like. So Daniel's going through it right now. So there's so much that I can ask, but I guess, who is Hanzi Freinacht, and why did you decide to use an alter ego or pen name for these books that you released?
So, I mean, I don't give too much on official channels. I don't give too much backstage knowledge about Hanzi Freinacht. Hanzi
Mm.
Freinacht is his own entity and an embodiment in many ways of metamodern cultural sensibilities, but also perhaps a voice that can speak more clearly and loudly than any one particular individual would do in their normal life, so to speak. Well, he lives in the Alps. I also lived in the Alps, but Hanzi is always in the Alps, and he lives at the crossroads in fact and fiction. And I think actually all of us do live at the crossroads of fact and fiction. And we walk around in everyday life, and we have all of these facts limiting us and of course empowering us in different ways, the actualities of everyday life. But we also walk around imagining things all the time, and it's difficult to know exactly where one thing begins and the other thing ends, right? And there are ways in which you can oscillate between fact and fiction, where you can go farther into fact and then farther into fiction, and then ironically you get farther into sincerity and truth, with the oscillation between sincerity and irony and sincerity, right? And that's also kind of how the metamodern cultural sensibility works, that, well, after a while we're tired of all of these different postmodern cynicisms and deconstructions and so forth, and we sense life can and should have more directionality than that. And we sense that we can't always be stuck in simply critiquing everything. We can't always be stuck in one big South Park episode, right, where everything is absurd and you always distance yourself, or for that matter, you know, even a super impressive person like Greta Thunberg, right? What she does is to, and she does very well, is to be an antithesis of the structures of society that we know, the powers that be, and kind of a critical voice that beckons us to be something else and something better. And that's also kind of what all of the big postmodern intellectuals were. If you think of a person like Foucault, he would Michel Foucault, the emblematic postmodern philosopher and sociologist. He was explicitly asked at one point, well, you're against everything, you critique everything, you pick everything apart. What are you for? What do you want to create? What are you against? What do you want? And he said, well, there are so many engineers in the world and so many economists in the world, and they're busy building. I'm just here to critique. I'm just here to pick things apart, right? And eventually, though, if that skepticism grows and becomes the dominant mode of thinking in, say, academia, coming up with suggestions, with grand solutions or stories or sense of direction for society as a whole, or just visions, right? Political visions, or just really using your sociological imagination, becomes almost taboo. It's viewed as immature. And this writer, David Foster Wallace, who is often considered a literary precursor or early metamodernist, right? He explicitly said that the postmodern ironists, they risk a gasp or a squeal, or, you know, oh, that's shocking, or that's terrible, or that's nihilistic, or outrageous. Whereas the metamodernist has another kind of bravery, right? He or she risks the rolled eyes, the oh how banal, the accusation of being too credulous, right? The accusation of being naive, and that's another leitmotif of metamodernism is informed naivety. So in a sense, it really grows from an oversaturated cultural space of postmodern critique, deconstruction, and irony. And another author just entered the scene recently in this field is called Jason Ananda Storm, I believe. He put it this way. So if postmodern sentiment is skepticism towards everything, in particular towards the grand narratives, but skepticism towards everything, turning every rock, always looking for the exception, always for the contradiction, for the crack in the wall, right, of big constructions or models or empires, right, or even in language itself. Then the metamodern, the postmodern sentiment brought to its conclusion becomes skeptical even of skepticism itself, right? Mm-hmm. So, and what happens when you're skeptical of skepticism itself? Well, it's a little bit like this saying. There's a simplicity on the other side of complexity. Likewise, there is a faith on the other side of cynicism, right? So it's not the naive faith of the modern project and progress that you can find in, for instance, thinkers like Steven Pinker, or in present-day mainstream libertarians who, you know, they look at all the poverty reduction and so on that's been happening globally, and they say, please let's not change this. The direction is the right one. We're on a good path here. So that's a naive kind of progressivism, right? The metamodernist accepts the postmodern critique. It says, okay, this thing is going to break. Things grow and then they stop growing and then they die, right? And the present world system is no exception. And it's a fossil fuel based economy and civilization down to its core. And, you know, as Václav Smil, this Canadian Czech environmental scientist says, you know, you have steel, you have concrete, you have ammonia that you use for all fertilizer and all of that stuff, and plastics, without which society cannot function. You could, even if you recycle all the excrement of all humans and so on, we could really, in reality, only feed half the world's population if we didn't have a fossil fuel economy, right? So knowing those crises, or that multi-pronged ecological crises, and understanding that there are social crises that come with that, and cultural crises, and that there is alienation happening, and that there is a sense-making crisis happening because of the flawed architecture of the information society, accepting all of those critiques, right? And still, you know, doggedly focusing on direction, on sense of direction, on going somewhere together as a society, on hope, but also on renewed faith, and faith renewed to the degree that it almost becomes a religious faith, right? That you almost redeem some kind of sense of the divine, some kind of sense of, a holy war of perspective taking, where you see the better you become at taking the perspectives of others, the better you become at coordinating those perspectives, and the better you become at creating conditions for development or co-development of multiple perspectives, so that we can coexist and co-create new solutions, coexist in the world and co-create new solutions in the world, right? So there's a fountain of hope that opens up in the heart of the metamodernist that comes after all of those critiques that have come in the postmodern era, or the postmodern postmodern culture that we've grown accustomed to, right? Particularly millennials, but it goes deeper than that. It's been growing over several generations, right? Yeah. Does that answer your question, or did I?
Yeah, for sure. It answered a lot of questions, and I think you started to kind of unpack metamodernism, and not like you said, not so directly, because it's a hard thing to really get at directly. And probably I just want to read a little piece from your book, because this is kind of as directly as you can define metamodernism. Is say metamodernism is a cultural phase, a certain kind of mood or zeitgeist. Metamodernism is a developmental stage. Metamodernism is a philosophical paradigm. And like you said, metamodernism is the marriage of extreme irony with a deep, unyielding sincerity. And that kind of, maybe that is more linear, more straightforward for people to understand. But is there anything else that you could add of like what the metamodern flavor is, what the metamodern stance is towards life?
Yes. So there are a few years since the publication of that book. So now there's actually a six-dimensional definition of metamodernism that's presented in this chapter, Metamodern Sociology, in this book, Metamodernity, which is an anthology of different chapters by different authors. But of course, if you say it in that abstracted sense, so it's both a developmental theory and a philosophy and a kind of sensibility that grows in society, and it's all of those things. But at the same time, it becomes apparent that a developmental stage cannot reasonably be the same as a sensibility that grows in certain conditions in internet society and so forth. And that's not the same as a philosophy, right? So anybody can learn the philosophy, or people can be at the developmental stage of metamodern structures of being and thinking and acting in the world, or sensing the world, or people can enact metamodern culture and popular culture and so forth without necessarily having anything to do with the philosophy or even the developmental stage, right? It might, with something that that takes so different directions, it might sound that it's nothing at all, but I very much insist that these things, that these three things that you mentioned are closely interconnected. So it's a metamodernism then is not a thing, it's a multiple ontological object that is real in many ways at the same time, and perhaps not real in some other ways. But there are certain things that can click, certain ahas that are there, right? And if people have those ahas or those entry points, the rest starts to make sense. That's the general claim here, right? And if those things do not click, then the whole thing sounds, well, pretty nonsensical, much like postmodernism did for a long time to most people, and still does to most people. And likewise, the same thing is true of the modern project, right? If you go to a traditional society and you explain things about democracy, modern rights, or you talk about these things, right? Or free markets and freedom of expression and the individual and so forth, it's just going to sound like word salad, right? But once you kind of certain thresholds have clicked, you start to see the pattern of patterns, that there's some kind of connection between what's going on the progressive edges of our cultures internationally, in the arts, in popular culture, and so on. That has certain connections to certain philosophical shifts that we're having collectively on the farther reaches of where bold and creative thinkers take us at this point in history. And that has certain connections with certain personality types or certain ways of being in the world that can best be described as a developmental stage, meaning that a person had some kind of not predetermined or easily definable, but still discernible shift in their personality, and to a certain extent predictable shift in their personality, where they switched from one way of viewing the world and being in the world to another way of being in the world and viewing the world, right? And that's why it's called a developmental stage, because then those stages are studied by many different developmental psychologists, right? So usually the strongest predictor for understanding what metamodernism is to the capacity to understand those developmental models, and perhaps sensing in one's own life similar shifts, right, that are described by the great developmental psychologists of our time, right?
Yeah, I feel like understanding the developmental stage theories is so important for our thinking and for evolving our society. And it's like something that it's like a meme that I try to pass along to people, but it doesn't always stick. They don't always like see the value of it.
And people also get allergic to it, right? Because it sounds like it can both sound the wrong way, and it can actually be used the wrong way, right? Can I ask you before we go on, how was it that you picked up an interest in developmental thinking to begin with?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm trying to even figure out how. I guess I must have also came across Ken Wilber.
Mm-hmm.
I came across his work, and it just seemed to align with like a lot of my interests, very much similar to you, like meditation, spirituality. There's like putting all these things together, all these different dimensions of a person. And I've always been interested in like frameworks, like before it was like Myers-Briggs, like the personality test, and there was the Enneagram. And I guess in some way it's like these things are like maps. Like I like maps. It kind of maybe gives you like a sense of control or like understanding reality. So then this was like a more advanced, because then you look at like personality types and, hey, yeah, this person has the same, Myers-Briggs as me typology, but there's so much missing, and then you go into like Enneagram and like, all right, this seems kind of more, something's deeper about this or more true. But then like just looking at Ken Wilber's thing, it was like, all right, he's including the types, he's including the lines, he's including all of these things, but there's also a more expansive perspective. And yeah, and just like, I guess seeing those patterns, like reading it and like, wow, I see these patterns. I see the traditional thinking. I see the modern thinking. I see the postmodern thinking. And then like, what's next? What is this complexity systems thinking? What is this stage that's able to look back, integrate, incorporate, and have this expansive view? And also it seems like that's the place where the compassion is at, where it's like, you speak about this, like having this kind of humility of like, well, if you are able to see at a more expansive perspective, you're able to see more, it is kind of a privilege. It is kind of like, a lot of times it's the circumstances, the environment you're around, and you're able to have this kind of environment, and other people aren't. So understanding that element, like the humility element of it, like, I had Suzanne Cook-Gruder on the show, and she spoke about like the importance of honoring all stages. Because I think that's one of the problems people have with the models is like, you could become like an egomaniac. You could become like, oh, I'm at this stage and this person's below me. But yeah, now I'm going off into this whole rant. But that's kind of how I got into developmental stage. And I actually wanted to ask you, like, like you speak about in the book, like the main problem with most holistic developmental stage theories. And this was really interesting because studying different theories, whether it's Keegan's the evolving self model or Susan Cook-Gruder's ego development theory or integral theory, all these models, it seems like they all have a piece, and then you start putting them together. But then there's also something, it's like, oh, something's missing or something's not quite right. So I'm just wondering, like, what is that problem that you found, and how did you start looking at developmental thinking differently?
There's a particular story behind that. Eventually I found my way to the integral community of Scandinavia and got to know a lot of interesting people and so forth. And in those circles, there were some people who were really into research on adult development and academics and so on. And one of them got me in touch with Michael Commons, the creator of model of hierarchical complexity. And Michael Commons is a mathematically inclined person, and it created a mathematization of those classical developmental models from a purely behaviorist perspective, purely, without saying anything about the mind or interior experience or and so forth of people. He just noticed that there's a pattern, mathematical pattern to the stages of development, and it's that the later stage, each later stage will coordinate elements from the earlier stage, and you can study this in real time as it shifts in people in their interaction, or for that matter in animals when they interact with their environment. So that was one piece of the puzzle. The other piece of the puzzle, I got in touch with that particular model of development, which seemed at once clear, much more clear than the others, much more clearly defined. It also had, it could add additional stages. It could create very strong arguments for why stages had been skipped in other models and so on, right? It could also extend very far up to Einstein level and all the way down to amoeba, which I found very interesting and appealing, because it also helps to connect humanity to other. There's an overlap in complexity between the behaviors of humanity and other creatures, right? So that was one part. The other part was, I did try then, having found all of these interesting things, like, wow, there's this sociological imagination. There appears to be this integral stage that people can advance into. There are certain perspectives that seem very powerful, and that could hold within them certain solutions to social problems in the world, and economic problems, political problems, and so on. I try to use those perspectives to create a political movement for integral politics in Scandinavia. So together with others, I wrote political manifestos and tried to organize meetings and so forth. And this project spread. It was called Initiative for Co-Development. So it spread to a bunch of different cities. People were having discussion groups, etc. And after a few years doing that, it was clear to me and to a few others I was working more closely with that the initial idea that we had that if it is true that people enter a modern stage of development, that become this kind of mainstream person in modern society, then a minority enters then postmodern critique of that stage, and then they become an ecologist, feminist, perhaps a Buddhist practitioner, or permaculture person, and so forth, right? And emphasize relativism and equality, and so stuff like that. And that was the one I felt I experienced mostly in academia as well, right? And in the humanities and critical social sciences. And then there would be a stage beyond that, which coordinates these two things, right? The progress of narrative of modernity with postmodern critique of society, using both of them non-arbitrarily on a case-to-case basis, but also reintroducing stuff from traditional society, right? The axial age religions, and even before that, from indigenous religions or indigenous cultures and so forth, right? I figured, okay, so if we gather those integral people, they're likely to understand each other well, people at that stage, and they're likely to be able to communicate with one another in ways that create alliances that are likely to affect society in a integrative manner that then creates more wholesome structures for all of the others, and perhaps still introducing new structures. For instance, a society that equips everybody with better skills of introspection, of meditation, of self-knowledge, of perspective taking, of emotional intelligence, and so forth. But having worked with that a few years, it was clear that the things didn't really add up, right? The people who were attracted to these kinds of projects were a very different kinds. There were a lot of people who were attracted to the spiritual side of it, but who had a very limited capacity to grasp the complexities of critiquing society and using your sociological imagination through co-creative processes, to reshape society and to ultimately revolutionize it. There was a chasm between people who are more mind people, like more complex thinkers, and people who were perhaps more spiritually developed, right? Among the spiritually developed, there were also recurring problems that people would feel and be inclined to have different sorts of magical thinking. If we just do this, or if we just follow our hearts, stuff like that, right? Or there's a synchronicity, there's a destiny to what we're doing, and so forth, right? And well, also insisting perhaps on introducing topics like energy work, not just metaphorical energy, as in sensed energies in the body and mind and so forth, but that you literally believe that there are energies and fields that you can manipulate or be part of, etc., or different forms of magical thinking in that sense, right? Which did not, in my mind, feel compatible with a modern worldview, with a scientific, rational worldview, so to speak, right? That were clearly pre-rational. So all of that shows up, right? When I try to gather people around, okay, let's gather the integral people, let's organize them, let's make them self-aware as a group and a force in society for society's development. So this chasm got me thinking, well, maybe at least we should have those two different forms of development, that complexity of mind seems to be very, very well described by model of hierarchical complexity, but it says nothing about spiritual experience. It says nothing about the state you're in, about being in deep resonance, about feeling that clarity, or the stuff that you can experience through meditation or psychedelic experiences, or sometimes through sexual experiences and so forth, or romantic moments that kind of break through, or the awe that you can feel in nature, or connecting through the arts and so forth. On the other hand, it appeared that if you take only the complex side, you find, well, intellects such as, for instance, Michael Commons, who is a mentor of my own, who doesn't really connect to the spiritual side. I mean, nominally, yes, but he doesn't have that drive, right, or that longing. And the man is very clearly a genius, but at the same time, not what most people, not at all alike most integral people and so forth, right? So there appear to be people who are very different, some more complex thinkers and some more spiritually developed, who are attracted to the same point, to the same value meme, to this being integral, but for very different reasons, right? And they wanted fairly different things, and they needed to be accommodated in very different manners. So in meeting after meeting, the same conflict shows up, right? That people are pulling in the direction of, let's have real content, let's talk about reorganizing the economy, post-capitalist structures and so forth, right? And on the other side, people will say, like, no, let's dance, let's embody this, let's not just be in our heads. That's not, we're never going to succeed with anything if we don't ground this in our being and in our relationships and our authenticity and so forth. So, well, okay, why are these two different groups somehow interconnected, right? And that's when, well, as you know, and the listeners may know, is that sometimes it's called modern, postmodern, and metamodern or integral are called different value memes, right? And that you have certain structure of your personality and your values. So modern would be orange as a color code, and postmodern would be green, and then you have other color codes for later things, right? Like yellow or turquoise. So why weren't the yellow and turquoise people? Well, and what happened, of course, was that everybody will start thinking, well, if this person doesn't agree with me, it means I'm turquoise and they're yellow, or I'm yellow and they're green, or something, right? Mm-hmm. Which was also fairly dysfunctional. So I felt, or me and my buddy Emil felt that in order to build the kind of political movement that can host and bridge this divide, you would have to have a clearer model. So we went from what is called value meme, which kind of sounds like it's fairly monolithic. You become orange, you become green, and then you become yellow or turquoise, right? To effective value meme, meaning it's the value meme is going to have different dimensions or different ingredients, and then in effectively speaking, you will still gravitate towards one of these value memes depending on different developmental properties of your own personal development, or the personal development that you have given a certain context that empowers or hinders you. So when we look more closely at that, we noticed, well, okay, so maybe it's more than two dimensions. Maybe it's not just objective cognition and subjective experience or spirituality. Maybe you can actually divide it farther, because even if you look at the complexity side, even if you have, or the cognition side, the cognitive side, let's say you have a genius level person who has a very, very abstract mind, but they simply live in pre-modern Europe, like a historical person, like I think in the book we use Thomas of Aquinas as example. And Thomas of Aquinas is a very great medieval luminary, but where would you rate him in this color code, right? Would you say that he is yellow or turquoise because he's so intelligent, or would you say that he's blue, pre-modern, traditional, because he's Catholic, and an Aristotelian, and everything he does is within that framework, or that cosmology, so to speak, in that age? So you kind of have to differentiate between two things. You have to differentiate between the complexity of the organism itself, and the cognitive complexity, and whatever cultural code or language that person has access to through their wider culture. And if you think about it, it has to be that way, because one person, no matter how intelligent, cannot invent a whole universe of concepts and interrelated concepts and models and ways of relating to the world. You're always going to imbue what your culture and the time you live in offers you. So there's a divide right there, and of course there's going to be certain interrelations between the two. So if you have high complexity thinkers, they're going to be more likely to, in our day and age, perhaps find their way to more complex forms of code. So they'll pick up on what's the word I'm looking for? Intersectionality, for instance, multivariate analysis. They're likely to pick up on complexity theory from the Santa Fe Institute. They're more likely to pick up developmental theory. They're more likely to view the world more interactively in terms of philosophy. They're likely to be process philosophers, for instance, rather than Platonists, perhaps. Whereas less complex thinkers are perhaps more attracted to simple dogmatic religions of even pre-modern civilization, whereas the mainstream are likely to pick up the modern, give or take, atheist, reductionist, materialist worldview, right? So they interact, but there are two quite distinct different things. So there you have code and complexity. Those would be two different dimensions, but they're both on the side of, and in a sense you could say that one is the hardware, the actual organism with a brain and so forth, and the other is the software, like that brain is operating upon. And very high complexity thinkers can upgrade or elaborate upon some of the software, but most of us most of the time just run some software that we have downloaded from society. Whereas on the spiritual side, there's also difference between very embodied people who have worked through a lot of things and people who are right here and now in a bout of spiritual experience, right? If it happens when people maybe first come across a very inspiring guru or something, they'll report that, well, there was a period or 3 weeks where I felt completely my mind just went quiet. I just felt crystal clear in the world. I felt in love with existence. Everything felt so cosmically meaningful, so self-evident, so clear. That person's in a high state, right? But then over time, as we age and we have ups and downs of life, and we deal with our traumas, etc., we can integrate those different experiences into our more permanent personality. And that's then the concept of depth. And that, people with higher depth, they can be of the darker depth kind, or the lighter depth kind. Lighter depth would be, I've had all of these highs, and I know, even though I'm not in one of those highs right now, I clearly remember it in everyday life. It's not as though it never happened. It's still there. It still informs my everyday action. When I look in the eyes of another person, I can see if the depth with which they meet my gaze has been to those same places, right? Or you can have dark depth on the Freudian side, right? Or on I guess Jordan Peterson is an example also of a fairly dark depth intellectual, that it's about being able to see the fundamental seriousness of reality that comes from truly having suffered and gotten through it, right? Have been to hell and back, right? So just on a very simple level, you go to a yoga parlor, for instance, and people will have these deep gazes. Some of them will be a little bit hysterical, right? Because maybe they're just following a trend, or you're supposed to have those look people deeply in the eye in this yoga parlor. But it's not all for show. There's also something there, right? A kind of sensitivity, a kind of refined, a kind of refined astuteness to detail, to really small subtleties of being together, to being in a room, being in one's body, details of feeling, and also other layers of what it is to be here and now, right? That stuff is a little bit more present, right? So ultimately, the metamodern project to be successful as a kind of vehicle for societal transformation needs to have a map that respects these these four different dimensions. Some people are going to be in higher states, some people in lower states and just feel more like everyday life, or usually feels, or feel worse than that, just feel fairly crappy. But that same person can have high complexity, and they still have unique value to add, and they can still then, for that same reason, be drawn the same effective value mean. Likewise, you have people with high depth, but they need to be challenged on their magical thinking. The reason they have such magical thinking then is that if life feels, the sense that life is more enchanted than their cognitive models can grasp, then there's always going to be pressure. There's more to life than I can grasp. And you're going to fill that extra space, or that window that opens, with magical thinking. So that's why you can have highly intelligent people, but because they have been on so many psychedelic trips and so forth, they actually still start to believe in some kind of weird magic. And that they've been speaking to aliens on their DMT trips and whatnot, right? Or that they can cast spells across the Atlantic and heal people over the phone and charge people money for that. I mean, they need to be challenged on those assumptions, but the depth they bring to the table, the embodiment, the energy with which they take up space in the world, is absolutely essential, and we likely cannot transform society at sufficient depth without those motivations that grow, that are sparked at those levels of the depths of the soul. So you get this four-dimensional picture of what this development really means. Now, likely there are ways to corroborate or falsify this model. First of all, only one of these dimensions has a very strong research agenda behind it. Yes, that would be the complexity. And second of all, you could perhaps change it into a five-dimensional model, etc. I'm not saying this is set in stone, but at least it helps to start to tease apart why integral or metamodern is not one thing. It's a surface phenomena, and then that's going to look very differently depending on who you're talking to. And the decorum or the norms or the modes of engagement in metamodern settings or cultures or spheres need to be aware of the mutual respect that is necessary of these different developmental dimensions, right? And try to balance them out, right? Because a lot of the bad things that happen in the world are due to such developmental imbalances, right? That something maybe well, an obvious example, Western civilization or modernity, it's perhaps a little bit reductionist in its, or more than a little bit reductionist in its view of everything. And for that reason, it becomes manipulative and extractive. And there's even an existential, just like you have magical thinking, which is kind of a pathology, I would argue. You have, or it's not a pathology in indigenous people, for instance, or indigenous cultures, I mean, but it certainly is in these settings, metamodern integralist settings. And likewise, there's the pathology of reductionism, which is you're more complex than you're spiritually developed, which means your mind always sees more than your soul senses, which means everything that seems enchanted, you can explain away. So there's a kind of gap between what you can see and explain and what you sense in the world. So the world seems disenchanted. And you get angry at that gap, right? Because it's not the world, childhood, or some kind of primordial divinity that we all unconsciously have promised you. You feel that, wait a minute, this is just bullshit. And then you get angry at the world. You want to turn the stones, and you want to reveal the frisky dirt it really is, right? You subtly want to get back at it, right? And what particularly provokes the reductionist mind is that naive thinker, the magical thinker, or the person of metamodern faith that somehow in the mind of the reductionist has sold out truth, sold out your soul to believe in a fairy tale. But actually, the sane balance that we can only achieve together is to both explain the world and re-enchant it. And that's the hardest task in the world, but that's why we need each other. And if we do that, I think many of the things that can flow from such a space is can and will be management of complexity and depth out there in the world, meaning resolving the deeper problems of modernity, right? So in a sense, in a sense, tackling this this multidimensional imbalance of development in us is also a utopian project, or I don't want to use the word utopian here. I'm writing an article here about using the term protopian rather than utopian, but it's a project that has to do with saving the world. It's not as trivial as it might seem, right? It's not about boxing people and just describing people for fun.
Yeah, I appreciate you giving us an X-ray of your thinking process and kind of how you formulated. It's not quite a theory, because it's open-ended, so it's still like a work in progress. Otherwise, we could just call it the Hanzi developmental stage theory. But you lay out the 4 factors of complexity, code, state, and depth, and you explained it a lot. There's I'd like to maybe dive into each factor a little bit more. I have certain questions. So this is what I was wondering, is like, how do we increase our level of complexity, and how much of that is determined by genetics, and also like what is the difference between horizontal and vertical complexity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm guessing. You probably know my positions on this because they haven't changed so much since the book was written. But complexity, then horizontal versus vertical, that's the simple part. The vertical complexity is which forms of reasoning are you capable of performing. The simplest examples are actually not necessarily from humans. You can say in animal etological research, there is Alex, the gray African parrot, was the experimental subject of Irene Pepperberg, and at Harvard, and she explicitly used Michael Commons. I met when I was with Michael Commons in 2014. I met her and explicitly heard her talking about these things, Michael's stages, with model of hierarchical complexity stages, with how certain dogs have higher complexity than other dogs and so forth. But looking at this particular thing, right, the gray African parrot, Alex, it's apparent that they're linguistically endowed creatures, but only if humans train them can they learn to use sentences. And for instance, this parrot learned over 100 different words and phrases, and could then describe such things as 2 yellow rings, right? So you have to understand what 2 is, you have to understand what yellow means, you have to understand what ring is in terms of a shape. So you can get Alex to get 2 yellow rings, and then he gets his reward. Now, that took a lot of training, of course, but without that training, Alex could not put together, he could understand simple concepts, but could not put together sentences, right? So he has shifted in cognitive stage. Now, of course, an African parrot brain is a lot smaller than a human brain. So it's going to be slower, meaning it has much lower IQ. So it's going to make more errors. It's going to have to think really hard, like say, it's going to like really tick tock, and almost hear the clock ticking when he thinks, like, wait a minute, 2 for him, it's a tough math problem, like 2 yellow rings, but eventually he gets there, right? Whereas a baby, a human baby newborn, they don't even know how to control their right hand, and they have no concepts at all, but their brain is still 12 times larger, 13 times larger than that of a cat. It's a really quick and efficient brain, but it's low stage, right? Because it hasn't yet learned any levels of abstraction. Now, if we go back to the African parrot, we have gotten to what was called in the model of hierarchical complexity, this thing that describes cognitive complexity stages, Michael Comens's model. It got to stage 5, sentential. It can understand sentences, but it can't, group sentences into a paragraph. It can't create a whole narrative, and it can't draw abstractions out of the narrative. It cannot put different abstractions or different variables into the same model, nor it can coordinate different abstracted models. So if you take something that has to do with coordination of many abstract processes, let's say structural gender inequality in society, right? This is the exact example I think we use in the book, that structural gender inequality, you could easily get the gray African parrot to say structural gender inequality, and then, gets a cracker, Polly gets a cracker, but he or she cannot actually discuss there is a statistical difference between pay ranges of women and men, blah, 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 right? Which requires at least to fully engage productively in the discussion, what would be called stage 12, systematic thinking in that model. So there's a qualitative difference, right? And eventually, of course, the human child is likely to be able to do more abstract feats than the parrot. However, it takes years. You have to be post-toddler to actually be at a higher stage, right? So those are two different dimensions of that. Now, when it comes to comparing an African gray parrot with a human being, it becomes fairly apparent that it's genetic to a very high degree, because I mean, what operations, like what structures of the mind can exist when the operations are in this small brain versus in this huge thing, right? Are different. You can have more abstract patterns or patterns of patterns emerge in the larger brain, right? And that's, of course, to a large extent genetic. Now, if we were to take that human baby and never teach them anything and just feed them with by a milkshake straw and keep them in a dark room until their 20th birthday, they're still not likely to have advanced in cognitive stage, right? So even if it keeps alive and it is brain grows, of course, it's going to grow less because of less stimulation and so forth. But even with perfect nutrition and so forth, it won't advance. So stages advance through loop processes, through feedback processes of the interior with its umwelt, with its own environment or world, right? Which then the nature of which then changes, right? A 2-year-old does not live in a world where structural gender inequalities is an object of its mind. However, a sociology student, sophomore sociology student, walks down the street, notices how women are treated differently even on the sidewalk, will think, aha, structural gender inequality, right? And then that becomes an object of their umwelt, right, of their environment. So obviously it's 100%. It's 100% genetics, and it's 100% environment. That being said, the genetic factor among the human populations is unfortunately probably fairly strong. we don't know. There is not enough research on this, but by parallel, we could take a thing like IQ, and there the consensus is that if you know the IQ score of both parents, you can predict about 70% of the variation of the IQ of the kids. Other things play a part, like if you were the first kid, you have slightly higher IQ on average, and so forth, right? And food that your mother had access to when she was pregnant. All of those things matter, of course. But the biological part is fairly strong, and probably it can explain more than half of the variance. That being said, there's plenty left to be done with the rest. If genetics would explain 60%, there's probably a lot to be done with the rest that you can affect in different ways. And if you consider that for a moment, given that an average human being at reaching adulthood would have stage 11 at the model of hierarchical complexity out of these 16 stages. Given that human beings have more stages they go through, that also means that the variance is going to be higher. The potentiality to go several stages below 11 is going to vary more than in an animal who that has maximal stage, let's say 5. So in parrots, you might have stage 4 or 5 parrots, but you're not going to have stage 4 through 11 parrots, right? So given that human beings have these much more complex structures that evolve over time, they can land on many more different end results. So if the average is 11 and with a normal distribution, you're going to have more leeway to change. The normal human population goes between stage 9 and 12, which varies a lot more than just one or two or three different stages that dogs can be in, for instance, when they reach adulthood. So given that highly plastic nature of our species, and just the sheer fact of having such high stage, likely we can stimulate human populations into higher stages of complexity. However, that's not always a desirable thing. In terms of developmental progressions for society, it's likely that catharsis, meaning healing, and embodiment and coming into higher subjective states is the more productive pathway for us as a society to stimulate, because that's even more volatile. We vary from day to day in terms of subjective states, and of course that impacts how we really feel about the world, whether or not we're in love with existence, or existence is drab or even very dark or depressive to us. All of that's how we feel in our organisms. And if we're in higher states, it's likely perhaps that we'll have higher openness to new experiences, and perhaps also advance into more complex forms of thinking, given the right opportunities to do so. And just, of course, should be mentioned every time we talk about this, there's no one-to-one thing about higher stages being valuable in and of themselves. It's all context dependent. The reason that we should be talking about these things right now is that we seem to be at a complexity and, in a sense, effective value mean deficit in terms of the world's planetary society that we that we currently inhabit, that we have worldviews and values and personalities that don't quite correspond to the complexity and depth of the challenges we face. And just for that reason, for survival and for thriving in that environment, it makes sense to at least open up this can of worms, difficult as it is, to talk about what can we do to support inner development in human beings. So I'm cautiously optimistic. I usually warn people about is when they first hear about MHC, about model of hierarchical complexity, these stages of cognitive development, they tend to assume that you can just shift people fairly easily, and that you usually cannot. It happens few times in a minority of adult people's lives that they shift cognitive stages, and very rarely post 40, right? People at age 40, they can advance as human beings in many other ways. They can heal, they can become more whole, they can gain more knowledge, greater wisdom, so forth. But becoming a more abstract thinker after a certain point is fairly difficult, which is also what you see in intellectual history, that great intellectuals, they kind of explode onto the world stage at 25, 30, 35, and then their life unfolds on the intellectual scene from there on, philosophers, great scientists, and so forth.
Yeah, I got like 7 years left till my complexity tops out. But yeah, that aspect of development is interesting.
I just have to say the thing about 40, I don't have any support for that. It's just me winging it from what I can casually observe, right?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that the subjective state is probably the most important thing for us to focus on, and I agree. It does seem though that the complexity, I feel like I have more tools or understanding of how to work with subjective state than complexity. Like complexity is like, well, what do I do? Do I go and hang out with people that are great, higher complexity than me, or try to work on problems that are beyond me, and then I'm trying to reach myself up to somehow evolve in that way. But you mentioned that we have a lack of this development in complexity, and we need it to solve these problems going forward. But we also have, I feel like, a lack of high states. A lot of people have not had those high states. They've had low states, and they've been through hell, but they don't know that heaven exists. Mm-hmm. And then also you have people that haven't, this happens to me a lot. And this is the part that I found really interesting in your book when you spoke about depth. I would talk, because I've had the psychedelic experiences, and for me, the psychedelic experiences is really how you expand your depth. They showed me that heaven and hell are not, places you go when you die. It's just places in your mind that are here right now. And I've experienced hell and I've experienced heaven. And, a lot of speaking to some of my friends, it's just like, I would sense that there's something missing, and the way you put it in your book, like, that's exactly what it is. It's that kind of existential depth. It's just some people experience life between, 5 and like you say, between 5 and 7 or 5 and 8. And they kind of have the average states, and then they kind of feel good, or like kind of positive, optimistic, but they haven't maybe had that kind of mystical unity experience that maybe you would rate it at 13. And they haven't had the 1 or the 2 where it's just like existential despair. And like, to me, that, like, what I feel is that when there isn't that depth, it's you speak about it, like that there has to be an importance of being honored, our depth being honored. And when it's not honored, we feel kind of a disconnection, or like there's something that's missing. Yeah. And that's something that I felt a lot after having these experiences.
I mean, the internet really is great here, because it means people can connect according to interests and so forth, and according to personalities, and also according to such developmental characteristics or properties. And what happens otherwise, if you do not find enough, or if we do not find enough people who resonate with our experience of life, is that, well, we start questioning ourselves. Am I crazy? And we also get subtly angry at our our more immediate surroundings, or classical examples people will have will maybe, if there are different levels of complexity, you can out-complex people, or you can out-depth people if you have different levels of depth. So if you out-depth people or in your surroundings, it means, those things that are the most meaningful in all of your life, you'll want to connect around them at some point, right? You'll want to say something, you want to see, like, come on. And if there's just a dud, consequently over time, then, well, you get disappointed and you get a little bit angry, and you also get or resentful, or you also get feel alienated, and to start questioning your own experience of life. So then higher depth, for that reason, it coincides with spiritual alienation, with deep loneliness, and then with the psychological breakdowns of psychological mental health and psychological well-being, which is weird, because in theory, having the greater span and integrating it is the epitome of having a resilient mental health. But what you find is oftentimes the more well-adjusted people are people who are in the average span of complexity and depth, and you have minorities of people who it's not fun to be below the average complexity. If you're in the lowest 2%, you're below the normal range, but you're still not mentally impaired, clinically speaking. It just means that you go through school and you will be the worst kid in every, at least theoretical subject, in all through your school years, right? But you'll never get what they're talking about, because you'll always be several years behind. It's incredibly painful for those individuals. Likewise, you have hyper intelligent individuals, and you have spiritually developed individuals who have the opposite experience, but it's also painful, right? So at least for those who have stronger spiritual experiences and greater depth and so forth, they can find each other online or through different media, and kind of just get enough confirmation to feel stable or resilient in that. And from that position, just maybe drop the tendency to want to pressure, other people who just happen to be in our lives and didn't share that experience, to share that experience. And then, patience, then life happens, and before you know it, maybe somebody surprises you, right? But it happens in so many marriages. People notice that something profound has happened to me. I've started seeing the world differently, started having another experience, and I try to reach out about it to the closest person I have in the world. And it's like, there's nobody home. There's nobody at that. There's nobody at that floor in the building, right? So this floor is populated. This floor is populated. You can go and hang out with them. You go to that floor. Maybe of cosmic experience, maybe of some kind of existential insight, maybe some kind of profound hope that has started to grow in you, or some kind of despair, and they just don't know what you're talking about, right? And how could they? If they can't, they can't, right? If they have the same experience, they do, and they did. If they didn't, they didn't, right? And the same goes really for complexity. So of course, with cognitive complexity, you have the additional difficulty that it's expressed through particularities of code, right? So maybe one person's cognitive complexity is in the mathematical realm, and if somebody doesn't understand that mathematical language, you can't explain it to them. There are years and years of studying apart. And likewise with philosophies and other forms of complex reasoning. So that's an inherent problem in gathering highly complex thinkers. It's a project I'm part of now as well. It tries to gather people who create their own meta maps of knowledge and integrate them, or at least that get them communicating with one another, because in a sense each of them have dug their own trenches, right? And kind of by specializing, by becoming this expert, by transdisciplinary thinking and so forth, maybe 20 years of development into one intellectual project, it doesn't translate so easily even to another complex thinker. And that of course means that a lot of the most complex ideas or the best tools for managing complexity in the world are locked into these singular individual thinkers who cannot help but take a pretty tough psychological toll for the loneliness of the work, the sheer loneliness, and knowing that, oh, well, I have some kind of ethical burden here. I know this could I know that this could do a lot for the world in theory, but I'm never going to be able to communicate. It's a bit like the Midas touch, right? Everything you touch becomes gold, but then of course then nothing is alive. So there are certain, the developmental pathway is multi-pronged and multidimensional, but there is a directionality to it. The direction, however, does include its fair share of paradox, tragedy, and that's kind of where we're at right now as a community of people waking up to these topics, right? Okay, we need to take steps back from our already taken steps back and start to see the landscape of who we are, the different people who are invested in these thoughts, sorts of processes and ideas, and build ways of communicating, including very, very strict norms for treating each other respectfully, and there can be exceptions to that. You can sometimes bang the drums of war, but once you sit down with somebody, or once you engage deeply with their work, or once there need to be norms of communication that help this translation to come into being, or these bridges to be built, right?
Yeah, thanks for unpacking that. So many gems there, and the importance of interdisciplinary thinking, and like coming from different perspectives and not just being stuck in one specialty. I think that's important. There's a whole book that speaks about it. I'm blanking on the title. It's like something the endarkenment, but it talks about this issue. Mm-hmm. There was something else that you spoke about, and this is personally relevant to me, and I'm interested in this. And you talk about like a main problem in building spiritual communities. Can you just kind of explain what that problem is? And what I'm really interested in is, how do we potentially override this problem?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so this is also, of course, something I'm very interested in, and been thinking a lot more about since we actually wrote that chapter in the book. But the thing we write in the book is that, okay, spiritual communities are about spirituality, so they're going to be about subjective state and depth, and particularly about subjective states, because the guru is somebody who has the capacity to gather a community, particularly because there's a sense of transmission. People come across this person and then they're catapulted into some kind of very high state. So in a sense, the reason this person gets to be the guru is that people sense that there's something about how they sense the world that transmits to yourself when you listen to them, right? Or engage with them, right? And it is true, right? If just like emotions can be contagious, and rock stars can make you feel strong things and so forth, right? Given certain ritualistic settings, right? Everybody does stop, etc. Right? These things activate deep neural patterns in our brain that are ancient, and so we can, the larger the group, and then the more cohesive the resonance of the interaction, the greater effect.
And a hive mind.
Yeah, exactly. They can be like amps for that kind of signal. So, and if the reason that this person is respected and followed as a guru and listened to is that they somehow embody and express the higher states of subjective being, you have inadvertently built a hierarchy based on a very, very ephemeral thing, right? The subjective state. And the subjective state, I mean, first of all, we never know exactly if the person actually transmits something or if they elicited something else in you. You can't know for sure, right? And the second is you can't be because they're transient, the states always go up and down. It's like weather or whatever, right? You cannot be ever in the highest states. Or maybe some extremely rare exceptions, right? That like, oh, I just my family member just died, but I'm entirely peaceful. Like it doesn't really work that way for anyone. That it's there's not just sadness and feelings. There are also low states, and they affect everyone, like anxiety or lack of concentration and frazzled mind or all of these different things, right? And the difficult part of creating then a hierarchy based on that is that you never know for sure if the person you're following or that you're giving away power to is actually in that higher state right now, or if they're maybe for the sake of the investment of the social role they were already in, are faking it a little bit. And you never know if the next person next to you sitting there also on a spiritual path, trying to be open and get over their ego, whatever might be the dogma of that particular congregation. You never know if they're faking it, because the social expectation on everyone is to achieve those higher states, right? And that's why you got there in the first place. So you're in a place where you're looking for the highest possible authenticity to get into the realest possible you, but where the whole setup automatically slides you into the authentic sooner or later, right? And I think a lot of them, I don't think this is an exhaustive model of why these guru following congregations tend to go south sooner or later. But I think it's an important factor in it that, everybody will start acting with the norm of expressing the higher states, and then subtly disconnecting from actually feeling higher states, because you're disconnecting from authenticity, which is the most important thing to get in the higher states. And when you feel that disconnect, in turn, you've invested everything in following this one guru or this one wisdom teaching, then you start to project the higher qualities, the golden shadow, onto that person. And of course, power corrupts, right? So let's look at, in the book we mentioned Muji as a possibly benevolent guru, because I hadn't read any bad stuff about him up until that point. Well, now you can watch videos, and there's of Muji, and I have friends who are in that context, or acquaintances anyway. And Muji has a community in Portugal at the time. It's a, I think, British Jamaican guru initially. And what you see is lots and lots of people, especially the young women, for some reason, they sing about and talk about how much they want to kiss his feet, right? And how reasonable it is to want to kiss his feet, given all he's given to them. And he's sitting there nodding, and it's like perfectly reasonable. Now, of course, kissing, like hundreds of people wanting to kiss this old dude's feet is not perfectly reasonable. It is absolutely perverse, right? And that's apparent in any other setting, right? The only social setting where that could be, that twisted logic could somehow become entirely reasonable, or seem entirely reasonable, would be, okay, you literally think this guy is walking Jesus, right? Or God, or the voice of the highest thing that exists in the universe. And now, then, if you read up on the critics or the dropouts, et cetera, there are suicides, there's stolen money, there's community work that is close to slavery. There are threats, there are pressures to stick around, and of course, sexual misuses of power, and well, it's just awful, and it happened again, right? And if these things happen again and again, okay, maybe there's something wrong with the structure, right? Maybe there's something fundamentally wrong with that model of how to together work for the highest states. Now, I have said, and you have also said it at the same time, probably it's the most volatile or changeable part of this developmental spectrum, or these developmental dimensions, is subjective state. And it's probably the most important one, because, I mean, hey, we get a lot of energized, inspired people in love with the world and connecting to their higher potentials. That's probably what we need. And it's probably actually doable as a contrast to suddenly raising everybody's IQ and MHC, or cognitive complexity, or transplanting certain cultural codes across the globe, right? It's just not conceivable or doable or even desirable. And it's, would take pretty evil people to try to do that. So we have to somehow resolve this problem, right? Now, there are Facebook groups, for instance, Metamodern Spirituality, where people are exploring these topics. But by and large, what appears to be the path forward is, first of all, a democratization of the knowledge and the technologies. Second of all, a building from the bottom up through our institutions in wider mainstream society of equipping people with a number of state-enhancing technologies, skill sets, habits, I mean, starting from breath, then to posture, then to cardio, very important. Then to just weightlifting and training, does a lot for you. And then meditation, right? Not necessarily starting in meditation, and then of course knowing that meditation is a whole continent of different things, and increasing awareness of that, so that the average person really has a whole battery of ways of working with these things. And then of course healing in society, so that catharsis is built into its structures, so that the average person is not an angst-ridden young adult with an existential crisis of 7 years between 18 and 25, like I was, is pretty awful if you think about it. Not what I would wish for my own kids, right? So there, I mean, if you increase all of those baseline skills, habits, structures, knowledge, communities of knowledge, and institutions that support them, you'll likely have less desperate attempts. So this is it's kind of like the social democratic response to communism. If communism says we'll have revolution, it will be total, and like the more radically we do the revolution, the more grand the gesture, the more violent the revolution, the more pure the result will be. And you have the result in Mao's Cultural Revolution China, right? You do all of these huge gestures, but they're empty. They don't actually lead anywhere. They just feel good because you feel like you're really doing something, and kids are beating their teachers or whatever, and feeling tough about it, and it feels really radical. And now they're changing everything, but actually you're just making things worse, a lot worse too. So the social democratic response is, well, maybe reform one bit at a time, maybe give people a little bit more security here, a little bit more free time there, a little bit extra safety in terms of safety nets there, support for the family, and voila, you actually do create a welfare society superior to those of the communist or socialist countries. And you even kept the capitalist economy in the process, right? So what I'm saying is as a kind of spiritual reformism, a kind of maybe we're not ready for the most radical forms of spiritual community, because the energies, psychological or social, well, the psychological forces in them, inherent in those relationships, are stronger than our social relationships can kind of, we kind of blow up the cables, as it were, right? So that's one part, strengthening the general resilience of a larger demographic or population, and then seeing what emerges through there. But the other part is, of course, building metamodern communities, starting from the artistic to the spiritual, towards economic forms and post-capitalist companies and so forth, and then towards perhaps more political movements. But the main crux, or the main paradox to tackle is the democratization of the sublime. Which is a weird thing, right? Because the sublime, or this sense of greatness or exceptionality, etc., it kind of feeds on these exceptional individuals, on the exception, on the extraordinary, right? Whereas, which is the same reason totalitarianism is so seductive, right? I mean, you're cooler if you're Darth Vader, right? Darth Vader's troops, of course, are going to feel very strong feelings of cohesion, and of course, mass meetings in Nazi Germany and so forth, and the same powers are active, the same forces are active in all of these spiritual communities. Whereas democracy is basically everybody just nags one another until some alliance forms, and then 51% get roughly what they want, and the 49% are at their throats saying they're hypocrites or whatever, and it's awfully unsexy, right? Nevertheless, it produces higher collective intelligence. It doesn't hijack the truth making, or it does short circuit the truth seeking of the system as a whole. So somehow those forces that are so unsexy and decidedly mundane must be made sacred or spiritual. That meaning that we should experiment with co-created rituals which are about, that the main theme is about, or can be about, it can be about other things, but one main theme could be about the exposure of these collective sociological or psychological forces, so that you experiment, for instance, with having a random person come up on stage. This has been tried by a burner community in Sweden. Random person comes up on stage, and then they're the guru for 5 minutes, and you have to believe everything they say, right? And I mean, everybody who's in on it for 5 minutes, uses self hypnosis or self-suggestion to, like, everything they're saying is so profound, so true, and you give your wildest exclamations of agreement with everything they say, right? And what happens is, actually that person becomes the guru. They get in a flow. The people feel cohesion. The purpose starts to glow. You are actually co-constructing the guru worship and the higher states, but you're doing it with a sincere irony, right? That you're deconstructing, but at the same time, inadvertently, or not inadvertently, but paradoxically at the same time, constructing the spiritual experience. That's just one example, right? But the main topic, one thing is like totalitarianism versus democracy on one side. Another way of saying roughly the same thing is that you have complexity and mind, or reductive mind, critical thinking on one side, and then you have sense of enchantment, wholeness. It's also the spheres of the brain. Enchantment and wholeness and just credulity and openness on the other, radical openness on the other end. And they've even shown in research, right? You sit down, you meditate, you just do a short mindfulness meditation. What happens is people become more suggestible, that is more gullible, and their critical thinking goes down. And what we need to do is to create the right oscillations. And what happens is, of course, if you create a community, it's all about that side, right? You just reinforce that, and at the end of the day, somebody mentions science or critical thinking, they'll get tabooed, right? Or they'll get excluded from the group. What you need to do is somehow ground this wire with this side, right? With the critical thinking, with the complexity, so that you actually increase the collective intelligence, and you actually become more critically inclined and more individually autonomous, while at the same time playing around with forms of radical self-transformation in terms of states of mind and belief structures. Now, that is a slower path, a more difficult path, right? So it's a lot like democracy versus totalitarianism, but it is, in my mind, the only possible path. And then what you should have is many different many different thinkers. There's a wiki now gathering all sorts of concepts by on metamodern spirituality by Brendan Graham Dempsey organizes it, and I think I find that general space promising, because there are several thinkers saying related but different things, right? And experimenting with different ways of going about metamodern spirituality. I have my own take on it. There are other videos on that. We're already a little bit past time, so I won't go into it. But I also have a kind of theology that goes with this kind of reasoning. It's going to be in the hors d'oeuvre Hanzi book, the one about Hanzi's 12 life rules, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of things you were saying that there was kind of some threads that were moving through my mind that connected to that. Actually, like the word collective intelligence was really coming up for me. And you mentioned the guru exercise, and that's actually, I'm not sure if you know, but it's from authentic relating. Authentic relating, it's this kind of practice. So they actually use this guru exercise that you mentioned, where people go up, pretend to be a guru, and then other people open to whatever they're saying. And when you were talking about collective intelligence, and this is something that was a thread that was running before I went into this question, is using these kind of practices like circling and authentic relating as a way to increase collective intelligence, so people can be more attuned to, okay, is this guru really who he says he is? Are we having good sense making and understanding that, and developing that? Because you mentioned in the book that a lot of times we don't know what we're feeling ourselves, so we don't know our own subjective state. So how can we know somebody else's? But it seems to me that a lot of times, especially if there's a group of us, we have way better sense making, and there's the collective intelligence where we can kind of gauge, we can combine our brains, combine our minds to kind of gauge and feel things out. And there's more experiences, and then you kind of see, well, what is your experience when you're alone with this person? Or how do you feel? How do you feel intuitively in your gut being around this person? And I think that's like what the circling practices is. It's really all about, well, what are you feeling? Because a lot of times it's like we rationalize and we present this stuff, but then what's really driving is our emotions. So that's kind of like that's like the thread that's coming up for me. And also the other thing that I want to add to it is, you have the circling, and the other side is like the psychedelics. And now people can have these psychedelic experiences, and where it's like, you don't have to run off to a guru to find this kind of experience. You have people are having mystical experiences in their living rooms, and you're getting a taste of this. And now you're like, okay, this is something inside me that I don't have to, chase. So I don't know if, we can kind of start closing out, but if there's anything else you want to add to the collective intelligence, the circling, or psychedelics.
Thank you.
Potential.
I didn't actually know this particular practice was from circling, but maybe that's where it originated. So or maybe it shows up in parallel in different structures.
Yeah, right? I don't know if it started in authentic relating, but I just read a book about it and saw that this practice was just so interesting that you brought it up also.
So I mean, I very much agree with that directionality, right? That and what you're saying particularly is that spiritual seeking and attainment in personal and shared must not be at the price must never be at the price of truth seeking, right? So somehow we have to combine those things, right? And truth seeking means checking in intersubjectively what is true, right? So something can be true for me subjectively and not true for you, but is there a field created in the room between us? Was there a spirit visiting us, etc., right? I mean, the person who doesn't see the spirit has to say the emperor is naked, there's no spirit there, for instance, right? And so it's all about the social setting and the norms of what can reasonably be created or said in such a situation. What is particularly pernicious in our days of now we have a revival, I guess, of the whole cult dynamics in our time, right? Is that people will take those progressive things like these things we're talking about and just twist them slightly so they're highly corrupted, with sleights of hand. So, for instance, circling thing, there's something you can call a we space, right? The we space means everybody says what they truly feel, and then you connect authentically until you kind of feel like dissolve into this wider space, and you kind of feel something greater than yourself, and you kind of open up through the bravery of your own authenticity. Now, what happens if the facilitator of that we space has corrupt intentions? So they have everybody reveal, and then they start asking a little bit more personal questions, right? So that people reveal something a little bit sensitive about them. And once people are invested enough, that it becomes like, okay, it would now be awfully awkward to breach this trust or strong group dynamic that I feel a part of. They start going after like, hey, Bob, actually, I'm noticing something with you. There's some kind of doubt or resistance in you, which I feel is coming from a place you might need to work with on yourself. Has anybody else mentioned that? I'll give everybody a turn to speak. Whole ring says something bad about Bob. And it's like, now, Bob, this might feel a little bit brutal to you, but it's for your own good, right? It's now the part of you that's reacting is your ego. And beyond that, if there is something pure, there is something great that will explode and will be part of this greater whole. And we're helping you get to that part, which will make you very, very much happier and wholer as a human being. So you need to stop holding on to that resistance. And maybe Bob was thinking, hey, maybe this isn't such a real guru. There was something sneaky going around there, right? And what happens is Bob just had 15 people bullying the shit out of him. And Bob is completely broken. And he wants to get back to the love bombing part, which was the first part, right? And he says, okay, I'll do anything. And after a while, and it's like, okay, Bob, then why are you holding on to your own finances so so doggedly? Not even 10% for the greater community? Like, what kind of, et cetera, right? And from there on, so just keeping in mind that we need this vaccine against these cult dynamics, right? And that somehow we need this to be collectively owned and intersubjectively verifiable. And there are certain technologies I feel help with that. You asked me earlier about Hanzi Freinacht, for instance. Well, Hanzi Freinacht is a philosopher, not a guru, but he resides at the crossroads of fact and fiction, right? And Hanzi does things that have to do with transgressions of norms, which have to do with the creation of a new sacred, right? When you transgress norms, you smash a golden calf and you say like, oh well, look at these things instead, right? These tablets from God or whatever. But if you try to, like, what cannot happen is Hanzi will not fuck your wife, right? Which Adida literally did, right? And the reason is Hanzi is up in the Alps and he is at safe distance and he lives at the crossroads of fact and fiction. And if you felt you followed Hanzi a little bit too much, the jokes is on you, and then you kind of have to bring that back to yourself, like, wow, what was that quality in me that I noticed that I was putting somewhere else, right? And if one such little demigod can be constructed, right, we can construct more of them, right, with different qualities, not necessarily just a pandit or a philosopher, right? We can construct perhaps a saint, and gods for that matter, right? So that's kind of, yeah, I think there are ways to ground these wires. I think I don't think maybe it's my own path in life to really be that person, but who helps really bring that into being. But I see other people who are picking up that baton and who are doing very interesting work in those directions. So I mean, that wouldn't be mass religions, not at all, but it would be religions that are functional for, roughly speaking, people who are metamodernists, and which then would create a sort of energy and resilience around movements, which does create perhaps happier and wholer lives, and at the same time helps coordinate agency at deeper levels across the different social fields in which we might participate. So in the political field and so forth, right? So like, again, at the crossroads of fact and fiction, but also then at the crossroads of organized religion and flash mobs or something like that, right? I feel there is something. However, I don't have all the steps in my mind of how that would connect to larger shifts in society. Although, there's always Hollywood, there's always all of these nodes, right? If you inspire the right movement at the right time, the right vortex with the right people, it kind of seeps out in interesting ways into the larger systems. That's how attractor points work, generally speaking. So that's where I bet my little spiritual, the few little spiritual coins I have to give in this life.
I love how you framed Hanzi as like this kind of technology. I just wanted to ask you real quick if you've ever seen the documentary called Kumari.
Yeah, I have seen it. Yeah.
Oh, to me, that's like kind of like that similar irony, sincerity thing, and I think it's just an interesting thing to throw out.
That one ends in so the guru guy there, he ends on the antithesis, right? So once he has revealed himself, well, I'm from Wisconsin or wherever he was from, I'm not actually Indian. The people get disappointed and the whole thing dissolves, right? The point is, what would happen with a permanent Kumari, which really does have those spiritual qualities, but a part of you knew it all along, that this is a fake guru, but it's also, but through being fake, it actually becomes more real than, let's say, Adida, who actually was in many ways a fake guru. Like, sure, he was high state and high depth, but he was also an awful guy in many ways, right? And the teachings, that was another problem we didn't get to in the other section we talked about before. Like, what happens also when you start projecting on one leader is that, okay, so maybe they have this one very interesting quality, developmentally speaking, let's say Eckhart Tolle, but do you really want to take psychiatric advice from Eckhart Tolle, which people are doing on his web page? It's not a good idea, right? Because he's not, or do you want solutions to climate change from Eckhart Tolle, which he's also talking about? No, he doesn't have any of those solutions, right? And that's another problem, right? That we lump together many different qualities, and just because like somebody has one strong quality, we use an aura effect to think that you can listen to them in all sorts of other topics, right? And that's again where shared truth-seeking, deconstruction, critical thinking needs to ruthlessly disenchant what needs to be disenchanted. And then whatever we can find that is enchanted after that, on the other side of cynicism and new faith, then that would be really worth worshiping.
Daniel, this has been a fascinating conversation. I just want to appreciate you for your time and for your wisdom and for the Hanzi books. I'm looking forward to the
Thank you so much.
Looking forward to the new ones. And I just want to say, what is the best place for people to connect with you?
We will have new Hanzi posts coming out now for the first time in a while, once a week. So it'll be on metamoderna.org. So Metamoderna with an A, metamodern.org. And we will be starting posting. Hanzi will be starting posting on Medium. So there will be cross posts on Medium as well. And there should be 2 Hanzi books coming up. I mean, I can't guarantee exactly when, but one self-help Hanzi book on pop psychology, which goes into a lot of the topics we've been talking about, but doesn't actually talk about metamodernism. But it's Hanzi's answer to reply to Jordan Peterson's 12 rules. So, and then of course the one that's actually the part of the Hanzi series is going to be a book on historical development, where we try and, well, if one of the books swipes right, so to speak, or I should use my right hand, swipes right to towards against Jordan Peterson, etc., and that kind of self-help. The other swipes leftwards towards David Graeber, who doesn't believe in development, for instance, and has a new thick tome on that, and tries to say, well, explain that, okay, you should be against developmental theories if they're bad ones, but there are good ones, and you don't want to be without those. So that's what's coming up during this year. Well, yeah, but I can't guarantee the dates. The new content coming up on our webpage, though.
Looking forward to it, and I'll definitely be consuming it and tuning in, and hope to have another conversation with you and with Emil. Thanks a lot, Daniel. Appreciate you.
Yeah, I appreciate you too. Have a wonderful day.